Analysis. ICE policy on administrative warrants for home entry. Policy overview. A recently revealed Immigration and Customs Enforcement memo, issued in May 2025, authorizes ICE officers to enter private homes using administrative warrants, rather than requiring judicial warrants. Administrative warrants are signed by ICE officers after an immigration judge orders removal, while judicial warrants require a neutral judge to review evidence and authorize entry. This represents a departure from traditional practice in immigration enforcement, where administrative warrants have not typically been considered sufficient for entering private residences. Arguments supporting the policy. Supporters of the policy advance several legal and practical rationales. Legal authority proponents argue that administrative warrants in immigration cases rest on established legal authority. Once an immigration judge has issued a final removal order, supporters contend that the executive branch has legitimate authority to enforce that order. They note that immigration enforcement falls within executive powers, explicitly granted by Congress, and that administrative processes have long been used in immigration proceedings. Due process already provided the Department of Homeland Security, maintains that individuals subject to administrative warrants have already received due process through immigration court proceedings, including hearings, before immigration judges and opportunities to present their cases. Supporters argue that requiring an additional judicial warrant after a removal order has been issued creates redundant oversight that impedes legitimate enforcement. Enforcement efficiency advocates contend that the policy addresses practical obstacles that have hindered immigration enforcement. Obtaining judicial warrants requires additional time, resources, and evidentiary standards that can allow individuals with final removal orders to evade enforcement. Supporters argue that streamlined procedures enable officers to more effectively carry out lawfully issued deportation orders. Public safety considerations. Some proponents frame the policy as enhancing public safety by enabling more efficient removal of individuals who have exhausted legal appeals and received final deportation orders. They argue that effective enforcement of immigration law serves legitimate governmental interests in border security and rule of law. Arguments opposing the policy. Critics raise constitutional, institutional, and practical concerns. Fourth Amendment protections. Legal scholars opposing the policy argue it conflicts with Fourth Amendment requirements that neutral judges must authorize home searches based on probable cause. Critics contend that allowing executive branch agents to authorize their own entry into private homes removes the independent oversight that has protected Americans' privacy for centuries. They note that the Fourth Amendment's protections apply to all people within U.S. jurisdiction, not only citizens. Separation of powers. Opponents argue the policy conflates investigative and judicial functions within a single agency. Immigration judges, they note, work for the Department of Justice under the Attorney General's authority part of the executive branch. Critics argue this creates a system where the executive branch both issues removal orders and authorizes enforcement without meaningful independent review. In absentia orders, critics highlight that many removal orders are issued when individuals fail to appear in court, sometimes due to inadequate notice or inability to navigate complex proceedings without legal representation. They argue that characterizing these as full due process overstates the adversarial scrutiny involved, particularly when individuals may not have been aware of proceedings against them. Civil liberties precedent. Opponents express concern that normalizing warrantless home entries in immigration enforcement could gradually erode Fourth Amendment protections more broadly. They argue that allowing exceptions to judicial oversight in one law enforcement context may influence standards in others, potentially affecting all Americans regardless of immigration status. Community trust critics contend the policy may undermine community cooperation with law enforcement. They argue that heightened fear in immigrant communities, including mixed-status families, where some members are citizens, could reduce willingness to report crimes, serve as witnesses, or engage with public services, potentially affecting public safety. Practical implications for daily life. The policy creates various practical considerations affecting different groups. Households, families, may face new questions about responding to law enforcement at their doors and understanding what legal authority officers possess. Mixed-status households face particular uncertainty about potential family separation scenarios. Communities, neighborhoods with significant immigrant populations may experience increased enforcement activity, potentially affecting social cohesion and community engagement with civic institutions. Local governments may face questions about their role when federal enforcement actions occur. Workplaces. The memo's extension to non-public areas of businesses creates considerations for employers regarding workplace privacy, employee safety, and operational continuity during enforcement actions. Public services healthcare providers, schools, and social service agencies may see reduced engagement from community members who fear enforcement encounters. This could affect public health monitoring, educational attendance, and access to services. Economic activity. Local economies in areas with large immigrant populations may experience effects on consumer behavior, workforce stability, and business operations if enforcement concerns alter daily patterns of activity. Hashtag constitutional and institutional considerations. The policy raises broader questions about governmental structure and constitutional interpretation. Judicial review courts will likely examine whether administrative warrants satisfy Fourth Amendment requirements for home entries. Legal challenges are expected to test the boundaries of executive enforcement, authority, and judicial oversight requirements. Precedential effects. The policy's long-term significance may depend on whether it remains specific to immigration enforcement or influences broader law enforcement practices. How courts delineate the scope of permissible administrative action will shape future applications. Institutional norms. The policy tests establish practices regarding separation between investigation and authorization of searches, whether this represents an appropriate exercise of executive authority or an overreach beyond constitutional bounds remains legally contested. Rights framework. The application of constitutional protections to non-citizens continues to evolve through court decisions. This policy contributes to ongoing debates about which procedural safeguards apply in immigration enforcement contexts. Unresolved questions. Several fundamental questions remain unresolved. The policy's constitutionality will ultimately be determined through litigation, with courts interpreting how Fourth Amendment protections apply to immigration enforcement using administrative warrants. Reasonable legal scholars disagree about the proper interpretation of these constitutional provisions. The practical balance between effective immigration enforcement and protection of civil liberties involves legitimate competing interests. Different people reasonably weigh these considerations differently based on their values, experiences, and policy priorities. How the policy is implemented, including training, oversight mechanisms, and complaint processes, will significantly affect its actual impact beyond its formal legal authorization. The memo represents a significant policy development with implications for immigration enforcement, constitutional law, and daily life in affected communities. Both supporters and critics raise substantive arguments grounded in legal authority, constitutional principles, and practical considerations. The ultimate resolution of these questions will emerge through democratic processes, judicial review, and ongoing public deliberation about the appropriate balance between governmental authority and individual rights.